I'm a real estate lawyer who does a lot of work with associations, condos, HOAs, that sort of thing. I moved up here from Miami in 1986 when CorePoint was the developer. Through a somewhat convoluted chain of events, I ended up working with the Acme Improvement District Board, which controlled First Wellington. But that takes us back to 1972 when this all started. That's when Wellington as a real estate development came into being by county resolution. There was no village at the time. And one of the requirements and one of the standard practices at the time was to form a homeowners association, mainly to do things like architectural approvals of new construction and modifications, that sort of thing. And the other aspect being to make sure people properly maintain their property. Because that adds to value, it adds to quality of life. It's important in any community. I know people don't like homeowners associations. There are too many Karens out there. But when we got to recruit from the human race to run these things, you're stuck with that. So anyway, this is controlled by the developer. The original developer, their successor, and ultimately CorePoint Corporation, which somewhere along the line, before I got involved, decided they didn't want to do this. So they assigned it to the board of the Acme Improvement District, which was unheard of at the time. And while this was all going on, the legislature finally passed a law creating a statute governing homeowners associations. One of the provisions of that law was when 90% of the lots to ultimately be in the community are sold to consumers, the developer has to turn over control and have the consumers elect the board of directors. Like the Acme Improvement District, when they set up First Wellington, it was originally called First Wellington Foundation, but they just shortened the name. They had voting by acreage rather than one per lot, even though the assessments were one per lot, although they never collected assessments, which was one of our biggest challenges after the turnover. So this couple did the research to determine that they had hit that 90% mark and gone beyond it, and no one was paying any attention to it. And that research, being a real estate lawyer, I can tell you, took a lot of effort on their part, and good for them for that. But so Acme's now facing the challenge of how do we turn this over? How do we have an election? Especially when you vote by acreage. And so the staff put a lot of effort into putting it together. And the big debate was, do we do it as quickly as possible? And I happened to have been at an Acme meeting on behalf of a client, but being a resident, I got up and said, I'm doing this solely as a resident. It's gone this long, do it right. And get someone who knows what they're doing to help you. And Kathy Foster, who chaired the board at the time, and of course was our first mayor, said, well, maybe we need someone like Mr. Edgar. And of course, I'm thinking, cha-ching. So they put together a search committee, and I ended up being chosen. I like to think on the merits. And we went about the turnover meeting efforts. It ended up being a meeting at Landing's middle school cafeteria, and at great expense to Acme. And we're walking around, I've got a walkie-talkie on my belt, I'm like, what's the big deal? Why don't we just let them come in and vote? But Jefferson said, it's not a rule by a majority of all, it's a rule of majority by those who participate. So since we were voting by acreage, and you can imagine, the turnout was not the best, the largest single acreage owner could elect the entire board, as he did. And he's, of course, Wellington sweetheart Glenn Strout in Palm Beach Polo. By the way, let me stop for a minute and say what First Wellington covered. It was from Southern Boulevard to the north to Pearson Road to the south, from what is now Stribling Way, named after one of our historic figures, to the east to Owsley Farms Road, which is just this side of the Landings Middle School. And the number that was thrown around as far as membership was 10,000. I don't think that was quite right, but whatever it was one of the biggest associations in the state. So we went through this whole exercise, and of course, as soon as someone counting the ballots found his, it was a show over. I did, speaking with his right-hand man at the time, Mac McLaughlin, convince them that they should at least put one resident on the board, who was Joe Piccincelli, which is another familiar name, which they did. And things were going smoothly, except for the fact that when the Wellington staff put together the budget, it ended up being a whopping $72 a year assessment. But these are people, that's nothing compared to these days. Of course, these were in 1993 dollars. But there was an uproar over that because no one had been assessed before, and most people didn't even know why they got this bill. It turns out they did that because they didn't think our collection rate was going to be very good, and it turned out to be very good. So the next year it dropped to somewhere near $29, close to a third. So we're going along and just doing routine things. But there was this undercurrent of why is it that it's supposed to be turned over by the developer and it ends up being controlled by another developer. And these documents, by the way, the bylaws especially, were horribly out of date and just unworkable. So, this is the untold story of First Wellington. I talked with Mr. Straub and Mac McLaughlin. And by the way, Palmish Pillow got no services from us because no one went behind the gate to check the houses or approve the houses that were being built. They did that on their own through their own association. So they're paying $72 for nothing. But they're meanwhile controlling everything. So I made them a deal. I said, look, you've got the vote to amend the bylaws. So let us create up-to-date bylaws that changes it to one vote per lot, because that's how we pay assessments, and in the process change the description of the property subject to First Wellington to exclude Palm Beach Polo. So it was a win-win situation. And we very quietly went about that, and of course we had a vote, public vote, and explained what was going on to everybody, passed overwhelmingly, and now we end up with 5, I think, residents on the board of directors, as it should have been all along. And so that's how the First Wellington that most people who were around at the time knew came into being. It was an interesting process and virtually unheard of in the state, because normally no governmental authority ever runs an association. So we're going along. We created a committee to set up policies and procedures. We hired a management company, which in a different form is still around today. They hired inspectors to go around and see if roofs were clean and various things like that, look for violations. And those, at least one of those inspectors, by the way, became a code compliance officer when Wellington Incorporated, and they adopted our entire architectural standard manual. So we were kind of a precursor to the village in that respect. It was not without its bumps. And that brings me to the story of the pumpkin patch. The Methodist Church on Forest Hill every year has 2 things. They have the pumpkin patch to sell pumpkins to raise money for youth programs. Then they have, and this is near and dear to my heart, the Boy Scout Christmas tree sale. Problem being with the pumpkin patch that they had overflow parking, so people were parking on lawns and swales, and if there's a bit of moisture, it tore up their grass. And so the neighbors complained to First Wellington about that. And which was a problem, by the way, with people when it's raining and parking on swales waiting for the school bus. So we were kind of at loggerheads because the restrictions on that piece of property that First Wellington enforced had some vague language about you can only do things that are normal for a church. And is being in the pumpkin business normal for a church? Not an easy answer to that one. But the pressure was on. And of course they flooded the next board meeting with people. And had kids in Cub Scout uniforms sitting in the front row, putting on this show. And I was president of the Boy Scout Council at the time, so I'm like sweating a little bit. But we finally ended up filing a lawsuit, but it's what's called a declaratory judgment. We didn't want an injunction against it. We just wanted the court to interpret this. And even though we were entitled to it, we did not ask for attorney's fees if we won. Winning meaning the court read it our way, not their way. And the Church's Council was very cooperative. It was, he told the town crier, as a matter of fact, that we were as easy on them as we could possibly be in it. But of course, that never made the news. So we ended up settling that, and the pumpkins are still, we just saw them a few weeks ago. And the neighbors, they agreed as part of the settlement to try to control the parking. But it was it was the story in Wellington at the time over pumpkins. And it's that one of those damned HOAs. In terms of the village, today we incorporated in '96. Our 30th anniversary is next year, and newer residents don't remember that had been tried before and failed. So this was the second time they voted for incorporation. So the question became, do we need both First Wellington and the village? And I'm comfortable with the way the village works, especially since they pretty much stepped into our shoes. In fact, it stepped into our shoes entirely, now that I think about it. A lot of us knew the village needed to incorporate because the Acme Improvement District was pushing and pushing and pushing outward well beyond what their charter said they were supposed to be doing. And it was just an indication of, we need to be self-governing in a true full sense, not just in, maintaining canals and things like that. Meanwhile, Ken Adams had pointed out, and this is what really turned my opinion on it, that our front door was on the Green Acres annexation plan, long-term plan. And they could put anything they wanted on that land between the Turnpike and 441. They didn't care, we didn't have to care about what it looks like just when you increase the tax base, because they never see it. Meanwhile, as I said, it's our front door. And so that was one of the impetuses to incorporate The bigger one being, again, the whole idea of self-governance, which is quite frankly being threatened today, but that's another story. So we incorporated, and now First Wellington, which had gone through some political issues of its own. In fact, at one point I resigned as a council because I wanted nothing to do with the crazies who thought it was going to be, you know, they thought they were the village, so to speak. Then sanity returned to the board, and I got rehired, and my assignment was to dissolve it. Because there is 100% duplication of effort. And that's something that's never been done before on that scale. My partners call me Dr. Death because I do dissolve associations, especially commercial ones that are no longer needed. But to the tune of what people said was 10,000 members, never been done. But we did it. We used proxies. A lot of people put a lot of effort into it. And fortunately, the Not-for-Profit Corporation Act said that you can do that with the majority of those voting, which takes us back to Jefferson and those participating versus everyone. And so I got to chair the last meeting of First Wellington to announce the results. And I quoted Jerry Garcia. And I said, what a long, strange trip it's been. And it was. But it was an education, and it moved Florida, it moved Wellington's growth along to the point where it's pretty well fine-tuned. I mean, you're going to have, dissenters wherever you go. That's, and you should have dissenters wherever you go. To keep people in line. But as we did with First Wellington. But the experience was incredible. It really got me in tune with the community. I was telling Lori Cohen, the village attorney, this story, and she was involved with the Historical Society. She said, you should be on the board. Because of this background, and I ended up being vice president. Mm-hmm. And just before we started this session, I learned I got to run a meeting tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So it's good to have become a piece of the puzzle in Wellington, although a small one. But we all contribute our own way. There's an expression about never underestimating what a small group of dedicated people can accomplish, which harkens back to the Declaration of Independence. I'm not trying to put us on that scale, but it's still, it's rewarding sort of thing. It's something my three sons got to watch. They're kind of proud of Dad for that because his name is in the paper all the time. Mm-hmm. And we now have another generation. Kids, people who were kids growing up going to school here are now sitting on the village council. That's something. That speaks to the maturity of the community and how we've grown in the right way. And that's the story of First Wellington. And it's interesting for someone in my line of work. And it's been of interest. I've actually given a lecture on it to other lawyers, just as a sort of case study, if you will. And I actually went through something somewhat similar in Weston, where I represented the developer on the other side of it, where the town of Weston, which incorporated as well, very similar story just years later, wanted to control the bulk cable TV contract. So we figured out a way to do that, because by then I was used to figuring out ways. But I'm proud of what we did. I'm proud of the leadership that the board of First Wellington gave the community. And I'm certainly proud of the results and of the village in the way it was almost seamless transition.